Okay, so we're up on YouTube. Welcome to everybody watching there, and welcome to everybody in the Zoom room here. We're at the top of the hour now. Thanks for joining us today for the Friday webinar. We're going to talk today about mosaics for the next few weeks, actually, because we have part of our new Mosaics Collection series running now. And I'm sure a lot of you looked at the webinar last week that we gave, that just gave you a quick overview of the prep book, the grade 1 book, and the grade 2 book. And in terms of what's in there, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail, or actually quite a bit more detail today with grade 1, talking specifically about what we call group 1 pieces from our classical piano syllabus. Group 1 is baroque and classical style repertoire. So I'm going to go through, if I have my way, I'm going to play through about 8 of the pieces, talk about a lot of the pedagogical detail involved. And then I'm going to, if I have time, play through the rest of group 1 quickly, just so you can see what's in there. So if anyone has any questions as I'm going along, feel free to throw those in the chat box.
I'll try to watch the chat for you too.
That would be great. Thanks, Andrew. And Andrew, thanks for joining me today. Andrew's our publisher, Harvard Publishing House. You can order the books. Andrew, do you have a hard copy of the book there by any chance? If not, I've got mine. You've got them there. That's what they look like, folks. Those are the 3 that are available for order now. We hope that grade 3 is going to be ready in the next couple of weeks. You've got a nice solid binding on there. You've got the 2 badges on the back advertised. Take a look at our webinar from last week, September 6th, if you want a little overview about the forward and all that kind of stuff. Today, I wanted to go into more detail, and I hope to do that over the next many weeks from the piano, playing through the repertoire, talking about pedagogical considerations, and taking your questions. Those watching us after the fact on YouTube, on CCTV, welcome, and thanks for checking out the webinars. Again, you can find all the replays there. And I hope to do on next Friday as well. I'll hit you all in your inboxes next week with links to upcoming webinars over the next 2 or 3 weeks. So I want to start off first is something we talk about at the Conservatory. And when we launched the new Millennium series a few years ago, well, let's say 25 years ago, it was mentioned explicitly that in that series, the idea behind Conservatory Canada, and perhaps other conservatories as well, and the way that the exam system is structured is such that we want students to learn many pieces from the books or from the syllabus lists before attempting an exam and before feeling ready to move on to the next grade level. So for example, in my studio, I started teaching about 35 years ago or so, and Andrew, I'm sure, is about the same, if not more.
Yeah, 35 years.
5 years. Is, realizing early on that students, I was always nervous about when to move them on to the next grade. And I think it was probably taking a pedagogy class that enlightened me to this kind of system. And nowadays, I put my students through an awful lot before we even get to grade 1. Using the method series that I use, and I supplement it with all sorts of other stuff and rote playing and that kind of thing. We spend 2 to 3 years getting the students ready, for, let's say, from age 7, 8. It might take a little less time as they get older, but getting them ready to that point where they can read free notation at the grade 1 level, hands together, quite efficiently. So that when I give them a new piece at the beginning of grade 1, it might only take 2 or 3 weeks for them to learn it coherently with good fluent rhythm. I made the decision a long time ago to prepare my students in a manner using the beginner methods, whatever you're using, to get them to that level before even considering grade 1 repertoire, so that I don't have to be the type of teacher that spoon feeds them, that makes them learn more by rote, that makes them learn music that they actually can't read. I think there is some value in that, and I see students as they get older that ability can even out, but I just wanted to be more of a reading-based teacher. More lately, I'd say in the last 10 or 15 years, I've gone more toward the ear side as well to sort of complement that. This is part of the natural evolution that as teachers we go through as we get curious. But when we get into grade 1 piano, I don't let my students move on until they've learned probably about 24 pieces. At one time, it was 30 pieces before we'd even consider doing an exam. So that when they get to grade 2, again, they can jump into grade 2 and seamlessly, easily learn pieces in a week or 2. Sight reading, fluent, with rhythm. By the time they get to grade 2, they get to grade 3. If they've learned 24 pieces at the grade 2 level, in grade 3, same thing. They can really accelerate. And my students usually then, by grade 3 and 4, learn so quickly that I can get them through grades 3 and 4 a lot quicker than normal, like less than 2 years, probably a year and a half, even a year in some cases. And next thing you know, they're in grade 5 and can still read these pieces in a couple of weeks. And so then if I did that for a good number of years, and I realized by the time they were getting to grade 8, that they could learn still 16 to 18 pieces at the grade 8 level because they could learn them quickly. And so that's a lot of what I refer to and what informs my pedagogy, and a lot of our examiners I know teach the same way. And when we examine, by and large, we do hear students when they get to those upper levels, you can tell that they don't have that kind of background yet. They're kind of limited in their skill, and they're being squished into this little box, being expected to read this music and interpret it physically through their bodies in a way that they're not quite ready for. And so we see that in our exam numbers. We get lots of grade 1 exams, lots of grade 2 exams. These days, much fewer grade 3 and 4 exams, and then it just goes way down. We usually get a little bump up at grade 8, but the average mark in grade 8 is a little lower than we perhaps want it, because we feel that there are a lot of students, especially these days, they don't have as much time to practice. They're not quite putting the time in that we want to see for them to be really, truly successful, to be lifelong learners and get past that grade 8 level. Very few students are getting to grade 9 and 10 these days because of this, I think, this phenomenon where they want to be rushed through things. And, and that's partly one of the reasons why we're not publishing a grade 9 and grade 10 book, because we just don't sell that many of them, and not many students get to that level. So that is sort of a disclaimer I've been wanting to say in public for a very long time as the executive director of Conservatory Canada. I don't think I've ever done it. We sort of hinted at it in the forward of these books in a way, but I'm going to keep coming back to those principles as we work through this repertoire together in this series of webinars where we look in more detail. So again, what do you say, Andrew?
I think they get the joy of music more if they're playing, and then the pieces start coming along a lot easier as they approach 20 some pieces that they've learned, and that it's not a chore.
And I thought about this when I was talking. Thanks for bringing that up. That put in my mind something else I'd wanted to say about that. And that is, students are more likely to get to that next level. They're more likely to want to practice, and they're more likely to prioritize the practice, because like you said, they're having fun with it because it's not a big chore. But it does take a lot of time early on. And we all have those students, if we do adopt that kind of system, we have those families that come as well. So-and-so's taking lessons on the other side of the fence, and they're already in grade 5. How come we're only in grade 2? And I've dealt with this for decades. It's really hard to deal with sometimes, but you just stand your ground and you point out that these are the skills we're looking for, and this is why your student, your child, is going to stay in lessons longer, and is probably going to succeed in exams a lot longer too, should they choose to do them. So,
and I've always wondered, why is grade 8 the end in a lot of people's minds?
Yeah.
Just 8, maybe because public school ends at grade 8, and then there's high school, or...
Well, the high school credits have a lot to do with it too, right? Like, a lot of people know that they can get that grade 12 credit in high school if they have the grade 8 through either the RCM or Conservatory Canada. And so I think that plays a lot into it too. And it's just sort of, I'd say up till a few years ago, that was the level that most students could realistically get to before they hit a wall. And so now I think that's slipping. I think that grade 8 threshold is suddenly not as attainable for a lot of students for other cultural and societal reasons that we can get into. And we've sort of talked about in some of these webinars. But what we go back to is, how many songs can you learn at a certain level? And that's how the conservatory system was designed. And that's how it continues to be designed. So that's something we advocate for. And I'll keep coming back to that when some of you ask questions, or when we're talking about the pedagogy involved in how to teach these pieces. So I wanted to get that out of the way first. I want to jump into some of the music. It's a little bit difficult over Zoom webinar because we know about Zoom and how the sound works. We need to have original sound enabled. I'm using an external microphone today. At the moment, I have it optimized for my voice, so you're hearing my voice clearly. When I go to play the piano, this isn't going to work at all. You're not going to hear anything. So I have to make adjustments all the time. And so I'm trying to figure out the best way, and I experimented last week with the best way technically to accomplish that. It didn't work out as well as I wanted last week. I have to make more manual adjustments depending if I'm talking or if I'm playing. So you'll see me constantly fidgeting with knobs and buttons here. And there are times where I'm playing and talking in succession. You're not going to hear my voice as well. I'll try and project a little bit better. So especially on the recording later on YouTube, you can still hear my voice. But thanks for your patience with that tech. Most of the time I'm going to be optimized so you can hear the piano in detail. Otherwise, what I'm saying isn't going to make any sense. So I'm going to do my best here with the tech to try and manage that.
And if someone just clicks the closed caption button, you'll see everything typed out. So if you're having a little difficulty hearing us.
Is that closed caption in Zoom or on YouTube, or both?
So I'm looking at the screen. They've got the raise hand button, the share button, the question and answer button, and the closed caption.
Captions. Yeah, okay, I see it. Some of you will see it under the More button, Captions. And those of you on YouTube, you can certainly try and use those caption
Uh,
buttons as well.
we watch TV that way a lot, and apparently, a lot of movies are made for the theater, and they are not made for your television.
Right.
So the dialogue doesn't come out as clearly. So I thought I was losing my hearing, but everyone's having trouble with that.
I can relate to that actually sometimes. Yeah, what did they just say there? Anyway, let's get into the music. We're talking about Mosaics here, book one. Looking at this here, I'm going to put a copy of it up on the screen so that you can watch the music as I'm going along, okay? And where I want to start today, we're going to start with some Baroque music and getting down, or no, sorry. We're going to start with the one Renaissance piece in the book, and that is this medieval English song that I played last week for everybody. I'm going to talk about phrasing a little bit and some considerations, always thinking in these webinars now from the point of view of an examiner and what we're listening for and how you can edit the scores. We've edited them a certain way, but you have quite a bit of license within the group one pieces to teach your students about articulation and dynamics. And so I'm going to go over some of the considerations about those and why you have the license to edit. That's going to be the main theme that comes up today. So first, I'm going to play this medieval English air. It's from the 1500s. It's so old we don't know who wrote it. It's anonymous, as we say. And it's a great introduction to Renaissance style, which we often don't get to play on the piano because piano music wasn't written back then. It was all for keyboard and other instruments. But I'll give you a little idea of how this sounds and we'll talk about it.
I might point out some of the fingering. We have a sequence in bar 13, 14, 15, and the fingering goes 4, 3, 2. And a long time ago, that's pianists didn't use, or keyboardists didn't use their thumb or baby finger. So I was kind of maintaining that fingering in there for that reason.
Right. And fingering we'll talk about as well here and there too. That'll come up in some of these pieces. Okay, so here's Old English air, we used to call it.
Yeah, it's not on the screen if you want it on the screen.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I'm going to share my screen. We'll get this up here.
I shall not interrupt you again.
I'm glad you did. Let's try and get this full screen. There we go.
Very nice.
So I'm trying to highlight the phrasing there a little bit. And what I think about in this one is, in Renaissance music, it kind of evolves such that you get a phrase, it's got some rhythm to it, but when you get to the end of a phrase, it's often a long note. And even though we indicate 3 beats there, that's approximate. Students can almost think like there's a fermata at the end of some of these smaller phrases as well as the large phrases. And so Renaissance music, they often took their time between phrasing is what we understand. And so students have a lot of freedom. Also, you can hear me pushing and pulling the tempo just slightly here and there. It's definitely more relaxed that way. So students have the freedom to do that. I want to talk about phrasing overall. You can see in this kind of music and in Baroque music and even in classical, we'll see these short little slurs on the score, often indicating notes that are connected. But when we play it on the piano, what we want to do is have the idea of a 4-bar phrase with a crescendo and diminuendo that's, of course, rarely notated there. And students should try to express this. I used to do workshops for Conservatory Canada many years ago where they were called Stuck in the 80s, and it was students that were always stuck, getting 84 to 86 on their piano exam. What would it take to get into the 90 percentile? That's what I want to talk about today, is how do we get students so that they can impress an examiner to the point with their music making that they're scoring in the 90s. That's what I'm going to feature more and talk about today and going forward with these webinars. And so when it comes to phrasing here, we've got the first 4-bar phrase. You want to have that highlight on the downbeat of bar 3. Sometimes students may do it in a slightly different place, but to have the highlight of a phrase on a downbeat is quite key, and this is a really good example of it. I'm going to play again, and I'm going to put that highlight in different places. I'll just play the first phrase here, and listen to that subtle inflection that I add. Just a gentle rise and fall, right? That's what we're looking for there. And again, beat 1 is always the highlight. Here's the second phrase. There I tried to delay the highlight so that the highlight occurs at the downbeat of bar 8, right for the very end. You could also do a highlight at bar 7 instead, but this is one of those places where if you delay the gratification a little bit, the highlight at bar 8 makes that phrase sound and appear a bit longer. And one thing you'll hear our examiners often write is the phrases should be longer. We want to hear length of line, and that's what pulls listeners along on a percussion instrument if they give the illusion that the line is longer. I'll play the first two phrases again. Listen to the length of the line and the tapering of those phrases. That phrase kind of goes on a little bit. We get 4 bars, and we get these short, what could be little lifts like this. And we'll hear in some of the other Baroque music where that's desirable to have those short lifts. In this one, though, because it's a song, though, we're going to assume that the singer is singing a long line, and it sounds just as fine on the piano. You could do it with short lifts, but I think the longer phrase sounds better. And I'm also doing some pedal magic in this work. So I'm lifting with my hands, but the pedal is adding the resonance to keep the sound resonating a little bit and to add color to the instrument and add interest to and warmth to that melody. Okay? All sorts of dynamics there. They don't have to be exactly as written on the page, because back in the Renaissance we didn't really have or notate dynamics. This is something that we're adding from the piano because it's a modern instrument that's capable and sounds more interesting when we use dynamics. It helps get our point across a little better. And then the conclusion, I'll just play through to the end with the phrasing here with the highlights in the right places, or in desirable places, I should say. I'll play that ending a different way now. It's an interesting moment at bar 20. They go to the C sharp, and that creates a lot of optimism in the sound. And if we back away from that, we kind of lose the opportunity there that could have had when I made that spot louder. I'm going to play that again, making it louder. Right there, that's at 23. The downbeat of bar 23, I think, is the highlight of the phrase. You can see in our editing, the crescendo goes right to the downbeat of 23. There I backed away from that. It sounds musical, it sounds interesting, but it really takes away from the length of the line. I'll play that again, and I'll back away from that highlight like we often hear a pianist do. Where I think it's far more convincing if I make sure that my direction of the phrase goes right to the downbeat of bar 23 like this. That way you're going to have more length of line and it's going to be more convincing phrase. Those are sort of in more detail what an examiner might listen for, and how we can coach a grade 1 student to play this type of piece with that kind of legato and that kind of inflection in a way that sets them up to always be listening for that in their right hand throughout the music that they're learning. Now, it is quite rare that we hear a student playing like that on an exam, but it does happen. Those students are scoring in the 90s or the high 80s at least, but that's how we want to coach them to do it. And if we set students up in a way that gets them to that point so that they can read music more freely and quickly, then we have time before an exam or before a performance to coach them in this manner. Any questions at any time, throw that in the chat box as I'm going along, and I'm happy to stop and start a dialogue with anybody, with anything that they see. Let's go to Baroque music, and I'm going to look at page 10, the Bourrée in E minor.
That last piece, Derek, you made it really easy to imagine a singer with maybe a lute accompaniment.
Oh, cool, that's good.
So they rested at the end of the phrase there. So
Yeah, thanks.
really that well.
So Bourrée, this one dances along quite nice. I really like the editing in this one too. I think it makes a lot of sense in terms of where the short slurs and the staccatos are. And I'm just going to play it through once, and we'll talk a little bit about Baroque style and how we become informed on the articulation that we can use. So you can see there's lots of short notes, there's lots of short phrases together, and if students follow that level of detail where they're lifting cleanly at the end of each slur, you're going to get something that's, that sounds like Baroque music ought to. And so what informs that? And what informs the dynamic markings? You can see at the very end, instead of piano in the last line, I played forte. It's just something natural that I like to do. It can go either way. And so back then, we know that composers generally didn't include dynamic markings on their scores. And so this is just an editor. We've come up in this particular edition in terms of editing that I think makes a lot of sense. But you're free to change that and explore with the student if you have the basic rules down. Sometimes when something's repeated, we would play it as an echo or quieter. But the thing to remember is that we have dynamic levels in this time period, and the music can be expressive even though the instruments weren't so expressive. Back then, we think a lot in Baroque music, where I tell my students about small Baroque ensembles playing, let's say 4 or 5 instruments at a time. And when everybody's playing, that's a certain dynamic level. And when you have only a soloist playing, that's another dynamic level that's somewhat quieter. And that's what informs how we can play dynamics in Baroque music at the piano, I think in a realistic way for young players. In terms of articulation, how to know which notes are plucked and which notes are joined together, I think it's best to think about string players. A lot of people think we're trying to imitate the harpsichord. I don't think that's quite so much the case. A lot of it had to do with string players playing violins, violas, cellos, etc. The bow was shaped in a convex shape so that when they played and came across a string, that bow would naturally lift at the end of notes much quicker. And instead of joining many notes in one bow, they were often sawing back and forth with fast notes and even long notes to make the notes sound disjointed or not quite connected or not quite as legato. This effect with those old instruments, old Baroque instruments from 300-400 years ago, you could have many people playing those instruments and you could hear everything really clearly. In modern instruments, they have to adjust because it's a flat bow and you get all this extra resonance which would fill larger concert halls. You couldn't do articulation the same way. So on the old instruments it works well, but if students have that in mind, they can start to learn the dialect of Baroque music and apply that to the piano. Lots of short notes so that we can hear each hand clearly. The left hand also has something important to say. Left hands have these interesting tune, and that's how we can tell it's in Baroque style. The left hand is indicative of a cello player doing the same kind of thing. And we often want to make students hear that. And so the way we can hear both parts more clearly is to have this type of transparent articulation. And so you can see in the right hand here, following the articulation pretty closely there, but there are a couple places where I didn't even follow. For example, measure 5 into measure 6. I broke that up a little more. We often have slurs over the bar line going to beat 1 in Baroque music. And over the next few weeks, you'll just hear the sound, and every time I'll give you something different about what makes this articulation work. In general, for the left hands, half notes, dotted half note in the left hand at the beginning can be interpreted as quarter note, quarter rest, or dotted quarter note, eighth rest. There's often a little break between them. In reality, the notes are shorter than they appear on the score. And in the right hand, notes that are further apart are often detached. Notes that are closer together and faster are also often joined legato on the piano, and it sounds good because we're imitating what string players could do. On a cello, for example, if we look at our left hand as a cello player, on all string instruments, the strings are set not in a straight line, but in a pattern, almost like a diamond-shaped pattern or some kind of parallelogram, where the bow has to cross over, and that takes extra time, and you can't physically join it as easily, so they would detach it. Plus, you have the convex bow falling off the string much easier. The further they are apart, the more detached the notes are going to be. And so that's what sort of informs our ear in terms of Baroque articulation. I'll play that to some other pieces just so you can hear. Let's look at page 19. There's a minuet there that I played last week by Gambarini, where you can see lots of detached notes here because the notes are further apart, and you can see where we have eighth notes moving in stepwise fashion over the bar line, a slur going to beat 1. I'll just interpret this so you can hear what I'm thinking. So again, not too hesitant in terms of when to lift really clearly. It also gives us an idea of the dance and all the toe pointing and little intricate dance steps that take place. But faster notes joined together, slower notes are more detached, and of course the left hand is written with all of these rests in there. You see, I wasn't really highlighting the dynamics so much. I would do that again and think more clearly about what to play louder, what to play quieter, just to make it more interesting and to give different color to the instrument. Some of the solid chords in this time period, we can roll those chords to sound like a harpsichord. Don't be afraid to do that. Even with young students, they like to do that kind of thing. It just make them to conceive it as solid, but when the fingers come down, they come down slightly one after another. It's a neat little effect. So that's just a little bit of an idea there in terms of Baroque music. And then I wanted to go to this Rigodon by Louis-Claude Daquin. This is a really neat piece here.
This is exactly the same as the original score, except it was written for 2 recorders.
Right.
So,
and those slurs would have been there.
Yes.
So here's an example of when we've got the original score there, but knowing it's for 2 recorders where they have wind behind what they're doing, on the piano we're going to play it differently. I'm going to play it all slurred here so you can hear what it sounds like as written, as notated there, if we were to take those editings, which is totally acceptable on an exam, by the way. That's emulating wind instruments. If I want to imitate or do this on a piano to make it sound more like a Baroque dance, which it is, I'm going to change the articulation now, and you're free to do this. I'm going to have lots of short notes because lots of the notes are farther apart, and where the notes are closer together and over a bar line, I'm going to make these little slurs with gestures in them. And there's also a neat imitation in the left hand, between the right hand and the left hand. I'm going to try and bring that out so that we understand that the left hand is nearly as important as the right hand in Baroque music. it brings the music to life in a different way when we do it like that. And students have that ability or that liberty to do that in our auditions and play these in performance on an exam. Legato isn't always the best approach for the piano to highlight the dance structure. And so you can hear an obvious difference there when I take that articulation into account. Try and highlight the left hand, and sometimes in Baroque music it's just good if the two hands compete for attention a little bit, and they can when we make the notes transparent enough in their articulation. Okay, let's go to Air in F major. Back page 5. This one's just a nice one to listen to again. The left hand doesn't really have much in the way of slurs, and so I let the left hand be quite detached all the way, as if it's a continuo player. So in Baroque ensembles we have what's called the continuo group, which consists of a bass instrument like the cello or the double bass, in addition to the harpsichordist's left hand. They play the same thing together, and that would be the left hand of this music here. While the harpsichordist's right hand would improvise chords, and then you get soloists like violins or recorders or flutes, that kind of thing. And so here, these kind of dances, this is a really good example of a continuo group in the left hand and then a soloist in the right hand. And I'm going to try and articulate it with shorter notes in the right hand than indicated. You'll see these nice long slurs showing off the phrases, but we can certainly break those up and articulate them into shorter audible gestures. So I'll try and demonstrate that. A little bit of flexibility in the pulse as well. I always liked in this one towards the end of the middle section going into bar 9, or bar 8 rather. Just a little stretch, a little slow down. On the harpsichord, they would use articulation a little bit, but they didn't have a lot at their disposal in terms of dynamics. They would use a lot of time. You hear harpsichordists hesitating to bring out melody notes, hesitating and stretching time to bring emphasis because they couldn't use dynamics so much. We can do that once in a while. I think that's a really good place in this particular piece where students can feel free in Baroque music to stretch the time a little bit. It was a really expressive time period, much different than classical music in some ways. And so around the same time as this, there's this parallel universe taking place where you've got the Baroque composers doing their thing, but at the same time you've got this younger generation writing the beginnings of classical music where the textures aren't as complicated, the left hands are much simpler, the dynamics and everything is much more restrained, the use of time and rhythm is much more simple. And so it's an interesting thing. That's what was famous and fashionable at the time. It's only in retrospect 350 years later or so where we look at the music and realize that how great those Baroque artists were and how they were pushing that particular style and art form. But in its actual time there was something else already happening that was much more fashionable. So I'm going to highlight some of those pieces. Before I do though, I'd like to play through a couple of more of the Baroque pieces here just so you hear what's actually in the book. There's lots of really great classical stuff and early classical music we've captured here, and I'll play through that in a little bit. Well, maybe I did play through everything Baroque. Let's play through Sancho here, Ignatius Sancho. This is sort of pre-classic. And this was the next one on my list. Again, just to hear the articulation, this is a really good one where you have two note slurs with a staccato right after it. This was edited by George Lythurst. Really well done. I'll try and emulate exactly what he's written there. It's only marked mezzo forte at the beginning, but there's certainly room to do some dynamics there, and that's what I tried to do that time. Students have that ability. So that's another one of the Baroque pieces. This Leopold Mozart, I think is more pre-classic. We'll get to that later. And I did play through this one by Anna Bonn. I played through it last week, but I'll play it once here just so you can hear again the articulation, the idea of continuo in the left hand, and the idea of detached in the right hand, where the notes are longer and further apart. not hearing things. Sometimes there are wrong notes in there. That one got the better of me. That one's more classical in style. I played the rigodon, and I'll get to this romance in a little bit, and that's the end of book grade.
Probably worth mentioning, there's a number of unfamiliar names, composer names, and we've highlighted some neglected composers in the collection.
Absolutely, yeah. And we'll be getting to those. You've seen a few of them already. So this one, Andrew, tell us about the title. How did you come up with this title for this piece by Turk?
So I have an adult student whose husband is German, and I said, "What does this title mean?" And we talked, and he said, "Don't worry, be happy." So it's what the title means. I think it used to be called Carefree. You just got half of it before, so it's according to my German friend, this is a very accurate translation.
That's good. We like to do that. So you see the original title there underneath, but this is, or maybe the original title is not actually written there, is it?
It's Hans Own Sorgen. I'm not sure.
That is the title. Okay. Yeah, nice that you got that translation. So if you ever look this piece up somewhere else, you probably won't see this title quite the same way, interpreted the same way.
I thought this might catch the attention of some younger students.
Yeah, I think it would. Okay, articulation here. The left hand's much simpler in classical style. This is more of a pre-classic piece. I'm going to play around with the articulation of the right hand a little bit. I'm going to try and keep a lot of those long phrases, but you don't have to. You can shorten these up if you want sometimes. See there, I'm doing a lot of extra lifts throughout the piece. It doesn't have to be that way. It certainly sounds good when it's all legato, and if it was legato, I'd probably play it a little bit slower. A lot of it, my articulation is determined by how quickly I decide I want to play something. And that brings up another point, the metronome markings. You know, about 96. That's pretty broad. You can go certainly much slower than that, certainly quite a bit faster than that if you wanted to, depending on how the student feels the piece. In this one, you have quite a bit of latitude. So we have lots of classical music here, and I want to take a look at another aspect of phrasing through this one. There's 2 pages here. I'll keep the music up for the first page, and later on I'll switch it to the second page. But I'm going to play through the whole thing. And what I want to try and show off here is the architecture and the phrasing, which is very Mozartian, and that is you get a little 2-bar phrase, plus a 2-bar phrase, and then a 4-bar phrase. It's almost like 2 plus 2 equals 4. And what we want students to try to do is inflect those 2-bar phrases with the breath between each one, and then in the 4-bar phrase make it sound like it's all joined together without actually playing legato, but the inflection gives us the illusion that that 4-bar phrase is longer than the first line. So listen here, 2 plus 2 equals 4, 2 plus 2 equals 4, all the way through. So I hope that was clear. Again, try to inflect so that the downbeat is at the downbeat of bar 2, the downbeat of bar 4. Often the highlight should be on a downbeat, and it's often on what we might call it appoggiatura, or that leaning note that Mozart would often use, and this is Turk's example of it. And then in bars 5 to 8, trying to join that all together with a longer crescendo, which culminates at the downbeat of bar 7, and then relaxing from there. So that's sort of an idea. Here's what the second page looks like. I find in this one, Is it this one that has the left hand? No, this is another one I'm thinking of that I'll play in a minute. But that's the basic idea here, trying to follow the dynamics, but trying to really give that phrasing a clear, inflected line. That's what we really want to hear in this with students playing in their performances.
We could have split this into one page, but you can see the phrasing a lot better since it's four measures per system.
Yeah, no, I see. Yeah, that's great. And then again, you can see these quotes here I referred to last time at the bottom of the second page here by Mozart. The music is not in the notes, but in the silence between. And that's a reference to the timing. And we'll talk about that in some of the other webinars we're going to do. So some of the other music that we have here in the classical section, that Arioso I just played, we have a James Hook bagatelle. I'll just play through this. You can see in that one there's no articulation markings really, and it's not to be played all detached, but I'm adding groups of phrases wherever I think they should be. We've given you lots of fingering in this one, and the big thing I think here is dynamic contrast. The whole thing in classical music is about the contrast of light and dark, and that shows up in visual art of the time, and in music it shows up in our dynamic treatments of things.
It may seem like an excessive amount of fingering on the last line, but believe me, teachers, you will thank me later.
I know I did. Yep. Okay, here's Etude in C. This is Diabelli. Pretty straightforward. A lot of you probably heard this one before. Many different ways to do this. Because I'm taking an allegretto approach with this, which is a little bit on the quicker side, it's also lightly, there's a connotation of lightly when it comes to allegretto. I'm playing pretty much staccato on those quarter note chords. It's not something we're going to try and blend unless it was an adagio movement, let's say. And again, those leaning notes are really important. And then from measure 17 on, great at the grade 1 level to get a very simple Alberti bass pattern going for the young hands that doesn't have to stretch outside of the 5-finger position. So that's a really good one for that. Beethoven. Nice to have Beethoven. We're going to probably have Beethoven in most of the grade levels in some form. And Andrew, has this one been simplified at all, or is this just straight from Beethoven? Do you know?
I'm pretty sure it's straight from Beethoven.
Wonderful. It's so hard to see a piece at the grade 1 level like this. I'll just play it through so you can hear it. There I find it difficult. I'm trying to get loud at the end without getting too heavy or banging. You hear a lot of students come into exams with renditions of pieces like this that might sound like this. Where it's just simply a bit too heavy overall. And so what we say in the exam comments there is try to just stress beat 1 and keep 2 and 3 lighter. And if they can master that, this whole thing just sort of takes off a piece like this. Easy mistake to make though at that younger level. Diabelli, a piece called Daybreak. And that's a good one to hear, the 2 + 2 = 4. It's such a common architecture in the phrasing. You can see it very clearly with our slur markings there where the long phrase is. And even though it's mezzo forte in the last line, I start quite a bit quieter, some mezzo piano perhaps, in order to get that highlight on the downbeat of bar 15, and then relaxing from there. There's a lot of nice, really easy pieces, I think. Grade 1 level, true grade 1 pieces, but slightly on the easier side for these younger hands to really get a grasp of.
That's a great piece to start grade 1 with.
I was just thinking that too, yeah, absolutely. And then this Gurlitt Sonatina we used to have in our old Western Ontario Conservatory music books. I'll just play through it. Again, you'll hear me, the articulation will be a little lighter than we've written here in places, but I'll try and highlight the dynamics. Trying to be restrained even though I'm playing a little bit louder there. Lots of lifts, lots of dynamics. You even heard me probably add an ornament at one point. That's just out of habit with that piece. We haven't talked too much about ornamentation today, but I plan to start talking about that when we look at grade 2 a bit more next week. That one I've played. I haven't played through the Leopold Mozart. Let's listen to this. This one probably quite familiar to a lot of you. Being in a minor key, you can play with the mood of that a little bit, especially that second line, highlighting the different dynamics, but also trying to get them into the color. I'll do a lot of demonstrating with that and see if I can capture their imagination by trying to emulate some of those dynamics and sounds. Andrew, is my camera blurry?
Yes, I was just going to mention that.
Okay.
I don't know if you can fix that.
Just a moment. I'm just going to take a look at that.
I thought it was just a little glitch at first. Oh, there we go.
Just needed a little rub. Anna Bon, I've already played that minuet and the Gamberini minuet. And then this one here I haven't played through yet. A nice classical piece, really simple. Perhaps the second and fourth lines in the left hand's a little bit harder, but the right hand's so static. You can see in our fingering here, we're trying to change fingers on repeated notes. This is a really good one for that. Sometimes I ascribe to that and get students to do that finger change. Sometimes I don't. Sometimes if they have fast wrists, I'll just let them use the same finger. But that's sort of the fingering we've adopted here for this particular version of this piece. Again, this is probably one we haven't seen before. This was one of those rare finds, I think. Eh, Andrew?
Mm-hmm. I really like the pieces the committee chose. They did a great job.
Well, thank you. That one could certainly go slower. That's, when I look back at Andantino, I'm probably more allegretto when I'm playing there. That certainly can go slower than that if people want to. Rigodon we played. This Romanza I played through last week. So I don't think I'll do that today, but that's also a good one. If you go back and look at the recording from last week, that's a really great one to show off the 2 + 2 = 4 architecture and the phrasing and the dynamics and that kind of thing. So that's what I wanted to display everyone today, is just look at group 1. I think next week we'll take a look at group 2, grade 1, group 2, and that's all the romantic stuff. And maybe you know what I'll do is I'll go back to the screen share here just so people can see the table of contents once again for what we have in the book in grade 2, and you can take a look through that for a minute and see if anyone has any questions or get everyone excited a little bit about that. I'm just going to sneak back in here, change my microphone settings so you can hear me chatting a little bit easier. Now, if anyone has any questions that's here with us on Zoom, go ahead and ask in the chat box or raise your hands. And if you're on YouTube, which I can't check right now,
I highly recommend this piece called Keepsake by Brock Chart. I think he's the next up and coming composer you'll hear a lot more from.
Yeah, we'll highlight that. And then we also have a webinar here from Brock Chart from last spring. I would encourage everyone to check out his music. I've got all of his music here, and I hope to run into him again soon. I know he's still writing more stuff. But we're really quite happy to feature him. Of course, Christopher Norton's there, Deborah Wanless, and then you'll see some of the female composers, the women composers that were neglected over time. People like Edwige Chrétien, Marguerite Baluté,
and Hannah Smith is one.
Hannah Smith, Alice Tenier. So we'll look at that music next week and give you some highlights there so you can get excited about these books. And we thank everyone for joining us today. I'm just going to check on YouTube to see who's over there, if anyone has any questions.
I have a question I'd like to ask the teachers.
Yes.
What do you think of the slightly bigger staff size, anybody who's got their copies already?
Yeah, it'd be nice to know about that. Give us some feedback on that. We're experimenting with that. It's hard to tell on the screen here when we're screen sharing. It looks sort of like normal large text, but it is slightly more bloated than normal. I really like it myself, but we'd like to get some feedback from you on that. So we're coming up to the top of the hour. Andrew, did you have anything else you wanted to highlight or tell us about how people can order the books?
You can order from andrewharbridge.com, which is Harbridge Publishing House, or Deborah Wanless Music. It's my daughter Carissa more or less runs Deborah Wanless Music, and I run the Harbridge Publishing House. We have slightly different things we do, but store-wise, it doesn't make a lot of difference. I might mention we went with Circa, or the C dot with the tempo numbers. All of the streaming recordings will match those. Right. So what's written in the book is what's in the recordings. So we're working at getting all those out. The prep book is out now.
And then Lillian's asking about the recording. Those recordings, where have you released them? They're not necessarily on the CCTV YouTube channel.
Okay. They are in YouTube Music, for sure. Yeah. Amazon Music, Spotify, Apple Music, iHeartRadio, Deezer, and I think there's more. There should be on about 20 streaming services.
That's a lot of work, Andrew. Wow. So Andrew's gone and done most of the recordings himself, especially for prep grade 1, grade 2, grade 3. And so you can find prep grade 1, grade 2 out there now. Is that right?
I'm halfway through grade 1, okay. But it shouldn't take me too long. And I realized there is an error, one piece. There's 2 titles, but I accidentally did the same recording for both. That's an easy fix. I will have that fixed shortly.
Right. Okay.
So a teacher after the last seminar let me know that was a little problem. So.
Okay. Good to know.
And you get backing track. You can hear that with backing tracks. If you get the Super Score version, you can listen to all these at various tempos. And there's the music history videos. I've asked some composers, like the Gibsons, if they would do a personal video for students to watch.
Excellent.
Straight from the composer's mouth.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to say goodbye to the YouTube audience now. Those of you here in the Zoom room, we've started this at the end of last year, where if you want to just hang out a little bit, and I'll give you the ability to take your mics off if you have any personal questions for us. But we're going to stop the recording now. Thanks everyone for joining us on YouTube today. We'll hopefully see you next Friday as well, and hope everyone there has a good